Hi, I'm Shama Sawant, a member of Socialist Alternative in the United States.
Jag heter Liv, jag är från Rättvisepartiet Socialisterna i Sverige.
I'm a member of Socialist Alternative in England, Wales and Scotland.
Soy Mauro de Alternativa Socialista en México.
I'm Amel Dosivey from Workers' Socialist Party.
Ich bin Janine von der Sozialistischen Alternative.
I'm a member of the Socialist Party in Ireland.
I'm Natasha from Greece.
Olá, eu sou Jane Barros, sou militante da LSR, Liberdade, Socialismo e Revolução.
We, as members of the working class and as socialists in America, are fighting against Trump's right-wing regime.
Fighting sectarian division and building working class unity, our members are organised north and south and recently played a big role in the victorious workers' occupation of the Harland and Wolff shipyard.
Estamos trabajando para construir una alternativa socialista para los trabajadores y para la juventud.
Στο ξεκίνημα παλεύουμε ενάντια στις επιθέσεις της κυβέρνησης στα εργατικά και στα δημοκρατικά δικαιώματα.
E faço parte da luta com milhares de brasileiros e brasileiras que estão na linha de frente para lutar contra o governo Bolsonaro.
We are currently campaigning to have, self-organizing a gender strike on issues of national minimum wage, unemployment.
We're currently campaigning and protesting against the hated Boris Johnson Tory government.
Vi jobbar också för att tillsammans med unga formulera revolutionära socialistiska svar på utmaningarna som klimatkampen.
As many of you might already know, we just won a historic re-election campaign in Seattle, fighting against the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, Amazon Corporation, and Seattle's big business.
We're International Socialist Alternative, fighting capitalism and for socialism in over 30 countries around the world.
Hi, I'm Shama Sawant, a member of Socialist Alternative in the United States.
Jag heter Liv, jag är från Rättvisepartiet Socialisterna i Sverige.
I'm a member of Socialist Alternative in England, Wales and Scotland.
Soy Mauro de Alternativa Socialista en México.
I'm Mameldo Sivey from Workers and Socialist Party.
Ich bin Janine von der Sozialistischen Alternative.
I'm a member of the Socialist Party in Ireland.
I'm Natasha from Greece.
Olá, eu sou Jane Barros, sou militante da LSR, Liberdade, Socialismo e Revolução.
We, as members of the working class and as socialists in America, are fighting against Trump's right-wing regime.
Fighting sectarian division and building working class unity, our members are organised north and south and recently played a big role in the victorious workers' occupation of the Harland and Wolff shipyard.
Estamos trabajando para construir una alternativa socialista para los trabajadores y para la juventud.
Στο ξεκίνημα παλεύουμε ενάντια στις επιθέσεις της κυβέρνησης στα εργατικά και στα δημοκρατικά δικαιώματα.
E faço parte da luta com milhares de brasileiros e brasileiras que estão na linha de frente para lutar contra o governo Bolsonaro.
We are currently campaigning to have, self-organizing agenda strike on issues of national minimum wage, unemployment.
We're currently campaigning and protesting against the hated Boris Johnson Tory government.
Vi jobbar också för att tillsammans med unga formulera revolutionära socialistiska svar på utmaningarna som klimatkampen.
As many of you might already know, we just won a historic re-election campaign in Seattle, fighting against the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, Amazon Corporation, and Seattle's big business.
We're International Socialist Alternative, fighting capitalism and for socialism in over 30 countries around the world.
How's it going, everyone? Hope everyone's doing okay, staying safe during this pandemic. I want to thank everyone for tuning into this virtual rally of International Socialist Alternative. Please like, subscribe, and comment to our channel so you can stay up to date with all the information that we're putting out. We're in a unique opportunity to have speakers from all over the world right now and have a discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic and what conditions are like on the ground. We clearly need things like mass testing and the closure of non-essential industry, but with healthcare not necessarily being accessible to everyone and with supplies running out quickly, workers are being forced to put themselves in harm's way. If it wasn't clear before, it definitely is clear now that our system, the way we run our capitalist system, is not putting humanity first. And when we have examples of like Donald Trump delaying the manufacture of ventilators just so he can haggle the best price, when we have neoliberal austerity measures affecting the ability of the community to respond, it is clear we need a new way of reorganizing our economy. So today we'll hear from 6 socialists from around the world. I'm so excited for the lineup that we have today. Personally, it's going to be my first time even meeting some of these people who I've heard of the great work that they've been doing in their communities. All the members here are a part of the International Socialist Alternative. And if you like what you hear today, you should totally join the organization. I'm sure that there's organizing happening in your country as we are all over the world. We're going to talk about not only what's happening in these specific countries, but we're also going to talk about what workers need to do to fight back against this oppressive capitalist system that is allowing for the possible death of hundreds of thousands of people. So I want to bring us to Italy, which at one point was the epicenter of what was going on and had some of the highest rates of infection of the coronavirus. So we have Giuliano Brunetti, who's in Resistenza Internazionale. I'm sorry, Giuliani, my Italian is not that great. Please say for our viewers how you really say the organization and talk a little bit about what's going on in Italy.
Hello, everyone. So Italy, with over 11,000 deaths and around 100,000 people infected, is now at the epicenter of the coronavirus epidemic. And of course, as everyone understands, the reality is far worse than the one showed by statistics. Local doctors in the city of Bergamo say that the ratio of official death to actual victims in some areas peaks at 1 to 20. And this is because the population is not being tested, unless, of course, you are a football star, a big politician, a VIP, or a rich person. Otherwise, it's impossible to know if you are sick. And unfortunately, there is no exception for hospital staff that treat patients daily. And it's a real scandal if you consider that officially over 6,000 health workers are infected, but the reality points to 10% of hospital workers that are infected, and they are continuing working without being treated. And this situation is a situation where the NHS is unable to provide tests, but private companies are starting to produce them and also to export them abroad, for example, in the US. If you are an ordinary person with symptoms, you are told to stay at home and to phone back if your symptoms are getting worse. And the problem is that when the symptoms are getting worse, it's often too late and you can't get to hospital in time. It's sufficient to say that in Lombardy, 9 people out of 10 are dying at home before being able to get to the hospitals. And in this situation, we are clearly calling for the immediate mass testing of all the population, starting with people working in crowded places, old people, and patients with pre-existing conditions. So the health system is literally collapsing. In hospitals, everything is lacking. Tests, but also reagents, microscopes, tunic, mask, and respirators. And often we have doctors and nurses that are working with beanbag on them. In this situation, we already had 15 doctors that have died and 2 nurses that have committed suicide out of pressure and fear of having infected others. And there are, of course, also silent aspects of this tragedy, like people dying massively and alone in old people's home, horrible repression developing in prison, but also cases of domestic violence that is increasing as alcohol and drug abuse develops. Also, compulsory health treatment, which happen when the police calm down a sick person using violence and sedative, have exploded. They have been multiplied by 10 in the city of Turin alone. And we need to consider that the virus is only the best known part of this crisis. Another aspect of the emergency is that while the entire health system is fighting the pandemic, other key sectors are left without resources. To take just one example, you need to consider that the heart attack hospitalization have been halved in the last months because people that have heart attack can get in time to hospital. So Italy has been hit brutally by the pandemic for different reasons, but mainly because the national health system has been deprived of essential resources, with 37 billion euro having been cut only in the last 10 years by neoliberal government, but of course cuts have been going on for the last 30 years. To give just a short idea of the consequences of the cuts that are affecting hospitals, we need to consider that in Italy, in 1981, we had over 500,000 beds in public hospital. Today, they are 191,000. And in the meantime, private hospitals and private clinics have been submerged by public funds, especially in Lombardy, which is at the epicenter of the crisis, where 40% of the beds are in private facilities. With the pandemic developing, almost every day the government is implementing a new decree with further restriction. And a whole variety of measures is being used: drone, army in the street, geolocalization, fines. And that has led to an unbelievable situation where homeless people are fined for not being at home, and the fines can go up to 3,000 euros. There are also penal charges for those who violate the governmental decrees against contagion. In order to leave your home, you need to testify that you are not COVID-19 positive, but it's of course impossible to do so if people are not being tested. And now the media and the government are trying to put the blame for the development of the pandemic on the ordinary people, on the elderly person who goes to the grocery store twice a week. And it's a clear way to divert attention from the criminals that have destroyed the public health care and from the bosses that kept the factory opening. Italy has been under lockdown for the last 20 days, but nevertheless, we still have a situation where millions of workers are going daily to work. And in fact, for weeks, the Italian bosses organization, the Confindustria, has put all its strength to avoid a real closure of the factories. And we need to be extremely clear. By having done so, they are responsible of mass murder against the Italian population. They bear responsibilities for thousands of infections and thousands of deaths. But also, they have demonstrated to everyone that the life of ordinary people have absolutely no value for them. And in response to their scandalous greed, there has been a massive and impressive wave of strike to defend health, especially in the metal sector, but also in the chemical sector, in the shipyard, in the logistical sector. And it's important to underline that all those strikes were spontaneous, self-organized. They were not in any way promoted by the top leadership of the unions. And those struggles have shown to all the Italian population the self-discipline and the spirit of sacrifice of the Italian working class, which is clearly showing a way out of this crisis. Now, unfortunately, those strikes were completely sold out by the union bureaucracy that have agreed with the bosses and the government to continue production. And furthermore, a new decision has come and strikes are forbidden until April 13. Officially, all non-essential sectors have now been closed, but we need to understand what is considered essential. Printing and reproduction of recorded media is essential. Manufacturing of plastic production is essential. Financial and insurance activities is essential. Call center activities and paper making are considered essential. And that concretely means that 40% of the factories are still working. And it's now up to the prefects that are directly responsible to the Minister of the Interior to decide who stays open and what closed. And that means that thousands of companies are asking to be recognized as essential by prefects. Just in Bergamo, at the epicenter of the crisis, 1,800 companies have asked to be recognized as essential. And that is really showing how irresponsible the bosses are, but also how useless is the lockdown when production continues. And of course, we don't know how the pandemic will last. We don't know if it will further develop. We don't know if the peak has been reached, but we do know that we will get out of that with a devastating economic crisis. And we also know that they will try to make us pay for that. And workers now understand that millions of people will be left with nothing, that small companies and family business will plunge into absolute poverty, not to mention the millions that already lives in very precarious situation. And in this situation, an increased number of working class activists are understanding that privatization, that neoliberalism, that ultimately capitalism has failed and that a new society is needed. But also the ruling class understand that social unrest is developing. A recent report of the Secret Service points in this direction, the risk of mass revolt from below, especially in the south. There are already cases in Naples and Palermo of family organizing themselves to refuse to pay for their food in supermarket because the money is finished. And it's now clear that if this quarantine continues, without a strong intervention on wages, millions of people will face mass poverty. And trying to answer this situation, the government has decided yesterday to give 400 million for food benefits. And it's the equivalent of €7 per person. Maybe it's intended as a contribution for an Easter egg. And we need to be clear, we don't want their hypocritical charity. We want a full quarantine wage for every worker, for every family, as a way to build a decent life for us and for our family. But also we want to overthrow a society in which millions of people are condemned to extreme poverty. Today in society, there is a huge fear, but also desperation. But this desperation will develop and will turn into mass hunger and mass action. But also the general comprehension, the general understanding that nothing can remain as it was. And this situation will lead to transformation of mass consciousness and to mass support for our socialist ideas and to the ideas of a democratically planned economy under workers' control to produce what is needed, especially in a pandemic situation. This is the perspective for which we are working in Italy and worldwide.
Thank you so much, Giuliano. Those types of perspectives are so important when we're thinking about how we're going to organize ourselves. If you like what you just heard from Giuliano and want to be a part of a discussion and building these types of perspectives, I urge you to join the International Socialist Alternative. It's just insane to hear about the cuts and the austerity that Giuliano was describing and the effects that that has later on down the line when we do need more hospital beds, when we do need more community services. But it's inspiring to hear about the Italian workers who have organized themselves to fight back against that. So I want to now bring us to Ireland with Susan Fitzgerald, who is a leader in her trade union and is going to talk about worker walkouts in defense of safety and how workers can organize themselves. Susan, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Toya. I think inevitably this crisis is working out as a huge challenge to capitalism. It's an expose of profound proportions of the entire profit system and the failings and the inability of that system to meet the demands of the vast majority of people in normal times, let aside in a time of crisis. In articles I've read and in conversations I've had, this has been referred to and linked on the scale of a world war, and that's understandable in the sense that everyone is affected. But what we're pointing to is the lethal combination of COVID-19 and capitalism. Millions of lives already lost and potentially millions more needlessly lost. The profit system of capitalism obviously dictates that lives are expendable. Lives of working class people and the poor will needlessly be lost during this crisis, and we should never ever let them forget that, and we need to act accordingly. The tagline of governments around the world is that we're all in it together. Now that nonsense is being exposed rapidly. The rich in our society, these are regular memes on Facebook, have been identified as having an underlying wealth condition, and that means they get access to COVID-19 testing, which keeps them safe, while frontline workers and other speakers will refer to this, particularly in the health sector, are denied, not just denied testing, but denied basic, very, very basic PPE to keep them safe. Now, in the UK, there was an agreement reached. Unions were involved in negotiating this with government, but there was an agreement reached that 80% of workers' wages would be paid in a situation where a company was likely to close. And that means that the idea behind it is that workers are kept on the books but off the job to maintain jobs and people's wages during this crisis. Now that was an important step, but the concept behind it from a trade union point of view was arguing that the 20% shortfall should obviously be made up by employers. But what that's meant, and while recognising the significance of it, is that many workers now are taking a 20% pay cut, again, needlessly. Despite that guarantee being given to employers by government, many workers are also being made redundant, needlessly. In the hospitality sector, we've seen hundreds of workers, despite the fact that their jobs could have been maintained, their wages could have been paid, they were made redundant. 300 aerospace workers on Friday in Northern Ireland lost their job, again, needlessly. The guarantee was there. In terms of where workers are currently in work, in food companies in particular, where they're regarded as essential workers, what we've seen in the last week is the absolute criminal lack of protection for workers, lack of social distancing. In one example, there was no hand wash in the toilets of a meat plant. There was no hand towels. There was an absence of sanitation. It was absolutely outrageous. Now, we'll come on to that in a moment. Workers in that factory quite rightly walked out, like Giuliano said, in spontaneous action. Up until this week or last week, large supermarket chains, the big top three of the supermarkets, had no visible social distancing on display in their supermarkets to keep both workers and customers safe. No PPE, no visible PPE for staff. I was inundated with calls. My union is not the biggest union in the supermarket sector, but I was inundated with calls from workers in a union, outside of unions, ringing, asking how they can keep themselves safe and work in that sector in particular. In food companies last week, we've seen a number of walkouts of workers in meat plants in particular and other food companies. And what they were saying was the companies are refusing to, as well as supply PPE, despite knowing about this for weeks, despite seeing what happened in China, seeing what's happening in Italy as we speak. Companies knew about this for weeks and did nothing. Only now are they ordering gloves, masks, screens to put between workers. But they've come out right and said that they can't and won't maintain the 2 metre distance on a production line because it slows down production. Now, the reality is that in the last couple of days, we've had government ministers in Northern Ireland and in the UK saying employers should be careful not to put themselves on the wrong side of this pandemic, that they should act with responsibly. What they've done is they've wagged their fingers at employers. At the same time, in the food sector, overnight, they changed the law to say that you don't have to have 2 meters between workers, despite all the medical advice, despite the fact that you can be arrested on the street here if you don't maintain a 2 meter distance. But when you go into work, the obligations have been mitigated downwards, and understandably, workers are frightened and angry. And I think if we look at those sectors, other speakers will talk about big pharma, but if you look at the amount of money that's being made in pharma and food companies, they will make billions out of this pandemic. The sensible thing to do, instead of subsidizing these companies, obviously, is to take them into public ownership. That's the only way to meet society's demands at this particular point in time and in general. And it's the only way, clearly, based on my experience and the experience of workers over the last couple of weeks, to keep workers safe. Now, I think workers are right to be very frightened. And the concerns of workers have pushed action onto the agenda. As I've said, there were a number of walkouts in big food factories last week. One of them in my park, 1,000 workers walked out of work because of lack of safety. This is a well-organised workplace. And in other smaller workplaces, both owned by owned and part owned by one of the richest men in Ireland, were forced to walk out, lose a day's pay, which we will fight to get back, obviously. But their attitude was, it's not about pay, and these are low-paid workers. We want to be kept safe from work. We also see walkouts and action by energy workers. Mick will talk about the actions, I'm sure, of some of the construction workers and car testing workers in the south of Ireland. Other workers, maybe not protesting at this stage, are voting with their feet. In one of the largest food suppliers, 20% of workers are not turning in. In manufacturing, there's grown anger. Workers are really struggling with the idea that there's a lockdown, that the emphasis is on essential work going ahead. But in a much publicised case this week, members of my union were very vocal about the fact that they make carpet and the employer is refusing to close. Not only that, the employer is arguing it's an important essential business. And the contract that they're trying to get out is for the Italian market. Now, as Giuliano explained, I don't think anyone in Italy is overly concerned with carpet at the moment. But those workers are pushing and pushing for their workplace to be closed with their wages 100% protected. Workers have been calling for all sorts of actions to keep them safe, and that's been articulated in the need for adequate personal protective equipment, but also in the demand from many, many workers that I deal with for a shutdown of non-essential business. Now, I can understand that demand, and it's gaining an echo, because that was raised in construction in the last weekend or two, and construction, certainly in the south of Ireland, has now shut down for all but very essential, and that has to be teased out, I think, by workers and their union and worker reps there. I think workers very quickly in this recognise the significance of this and were able to articulate in a very strong way the demands that were needed. So safety, but also closure to contain this pandemic. And I think the fact that that was articulated first and loudly, most loudly by workers, indicates the role of the working class in society. It's only our class that are going to put aside all other considerations and put the well-being of the majority in society first. Capitalism are not even at that point now in reality, despite some of their headline actions. When you go behind what they're doing, it's not real and it's not enduring, because workers are still being roundly put at risk. One of the attitudes that's coming up, one of the discussions that I'm having on the picket line, workers, nurses who took strike action in Northern Ireland just a month or two ago, lost 3 days strike pay during this crisis. The emphasis has been on, we had thousands of people standing out at their doors clapping for our health workers. The hypocrisy of Boris Johnson doing that, so much so that the government in Northern Ireland had to pay back the 3 days pay that health workers would have lost, were due to have deducted from their pay because of strike action that they took. So there's pressure building, but workers here not so long ago, shop workers, other workers in the retail and food sector were dismissed and diminished as unskilled and effectively unimportant. Those workers are now the key and essential workers in our society, meeting people's demands. And it just shows that it's the demands of working class people were far ahead those of the capitalist class, and it shows a capacity and an intelligence that exists amongst our class, and it shows the capacity for us to run society in reality. Now, just to finish, even if this crisis is finished over a period of months, already governments now, even at the start of dealing with it, are saying and intimating that we'll have to pay for this later on, and that there'll be austerity to pay for this later on, is the strong undercurrent in all the measures that they're talking about. Now, whenever they try to do or actually enforce and offload the cost of this crisis onto working class people, there's no doubt that will create an explosive situation. The idea for a second time in a decade that workers would be made to pay for a crisis in society not of their making. Now, when they try and shift resources from what they've done over the last couple of weeks, they've shifted some resources away from the tops of society, and the role of the workers' movement, of the socialist movement and trade unions has to be to fight with people to ensure that it's not allowed to be shifted back. I've tried to focus, and there's not a lot of time, and I'll maybe feed this out to people more in the days ahead, on the role that's being played by workers now in the immediate face of the crisis. I think that's nothing to the role that workers will play after this, when they try and grab back resources. Once they've showed what's available in society, the resources that are available and how they can be deployed, although insignificant or insufficient, I don't think we as a class, as a movement, can allow it to shift back. In combating this disease, workers around the globe are identifying that the biggest obstacle to dealing with it is capitalism. And in reality, alongside COVID-19, the biggest, most frightening, dangerous disease that we're dealing with as a workers' movement is capitalism. And our efforts need to be redoubled in the weeks and days ahead in smashing not just this pandemic, but beginning to build a movement to smash capitalism.
Thank you so much, Susan. Talking about the slowing down of production being the main concern of these factory owners and these capitalists is just absolutely disgusting. And it goes against what experts in the health field are saying that we should do, whether it be 6 feet or 2 meters of spacing, protective equipment. It's just ridiculous. And I really liked how Susan highlighted the role of the working class and what it's going to take for us to fight back against these things. So we have 4 more speakers coming up. We're going to hear from Mick Barry, who is a Socialist Party member of the Irish Parliament. We're going to hear from Jackie Barry, who is in England, and she is an ICU nurse. We're going to hear from Pasha in Hong Kong, and we're going to hear from Shama Sawant, who is a city councilor in the US. So I'm going to kick it now to Mick Barry, like I said, who's a member of the Irish Parliament. And it's it's nice and refreshing to have working class candidates that are able to fight for what it is that the working class needs. So if you could talk a little bit about the repressive legislation that you've had to fight against over the past period, that'd be great. Thanks, Mick.
Okay. Hi, how you doing? I will say a few words about the repressive legislation, but first I'll give a short report on some things that are going on here. So in Ireland, we're at the early stage of the upward curve of the virus. We had 10 deaths today and 200 new cases. And on Friday night, the Prime Minister, or the Taoiseach, went on national television and laid down the details of a lockdown for the next 2 weeks. People were instructed not to leave their homes unless they're going to work for essential work, going to collect groceries or for medical reasons, and that people would be allowed to exercise, but only within 2 kilometers of their own home. The big talking point last week was the number of workplaces that were still open, non-essential workplaces. The government said no more than 4 people should gather in one place, unless it was your family, maybe bigger than that. But nevertheless, there were workplaces of hundreds, workplaces of thousands still opening every day. The trade union, which organizes construction workers, well, one of the unions that organizes construction workers, did very good work, putting up on social media photographs from construction sites across the country, where so-called social distancing, the 2-meter rule, clearly didn't apply. Showed that there was a ludicrous contradiction between what was happening in industry and what was instructed on the streets. In the call centers, the managers work from home. Many of the workers still had to go into to work. And even though the closure of non-essential industry was extended on Friday night, you know, company after company are trying to get in beneath the new rules. Medical companies saying that they're essential industry when they're producing, you know, artificial hips or artificial knees at the moment, contact lenses, and so on. So thousands of workers have been instructed to go into work in the morning in these companies, and I think that's going to be an issue tomorrow as the bosses try and put profits before lives. The health service is woefully unprepared for this crisis. Decades of neoliberal policies have weakened it. You have a 2-tier health service, public and private, where the private has been run down and made to fail in order to help the private health sector. Workers have been left without PPE. We had the first death of a health service worker at the end of last week, and there's a desperate scramble now to get the equipment, planes coming in from China today. 255 intensive care unit beds in the state coming into the new year, the lowest in the entire European Union, 5.5 per 100,000 people, less than half the European average. Again, a desperate scramble on that front at the moment. The government have been forced to temporarily abolish the 2-tier health system. The private hospitals will be run as part of the public service over the next weeks. They haven't said how much the private hospitals are going to be paid for that. Heroic efforts by health service workers, filling the breach caused by these big gaps, but a real danger that despite the heroic efforts of the health service workers, the health service has been weakened to the point that it may be overwhelmed in the weeks ahead. Now, I've been asked to deal in particular with the question of repressive legislation. So let's have a look at that. Repressive legislation has passed through the Irish Parliament. The government have the power to compel people to stay in their homes, to lock down entire areas, to ban gatherings in people's homes, to ban gatherings in public. The ban on gatherings in public give them the power to ban protests and demonstrations in reality. All workers going to work in the morning can be asked by police for ID to prove that they are essential workers. The government are aware of the fact that they will probably need to have an emergency budget in the summer months where they will attempt to make working people pay for the policies that they have to introduce now at the moment. And the emergency legislation extends beyond the summer, potentially up until November. So they have the potential to ban protest against any emergency budget. Working people saw during the week that the emergency powers extend for 8 months, but the new rent freeze and ban on evictions only lasts for 3 months. Now, the majority will voluntarily go along with restrictions for the next couple of weeks in the interests of public health. But if the government attempts to use these powers against the interests of ordinary people, that may be a different matter. In the Parliament, we spoke out against these emergency powers and cried out no when the Parliament was asked did they support it or were they against the powers. We pointed out the fact that in this country in the past, emergency legislation that was introduced against the IRA during the IRA campaign, the Offences Against the State Act, was later used against trade unionists, was used against student union activists, was used against the left. We pointed out that already in France, emergency COVID-19 legislation introduced by the Macron government has been used against the protests of the yellow vests. In the Irish Parliament, there are 8 TDs who would be seen as far left or radical left. 6 of those 8 TDs would self-describe themselves as coming from a Trotskyist tradition. But we were the only ones in the Parliament who said that we were opposed to this package in full and called no when the vote was when the debate was concluded. On Friday night, when the emergency lockdown was declared, a web page of the Socialist Workers' Party used the phrase, "This is the right way to go," in terms of confining people to their homes and the lockdown policies. And that's not just an Irish thing. We see it in other countries. I believe that in Portugal, when the ban on strike was proposed in the Parliament, the Communist Party abstained and the left bloc actually voted in favour of it. So some concluding points. I think Susan's comparison with war is an apt comparison. Of course, it's not the same as a war where millions of people die in the trenches, for example. But there are similarities. One of the similarities has been a rallying of the populations in the initial phases behind governments, boosting popularity for Johnson, for Trump. Here in Ireland today, the Varadkar's the Prime Minister's party had doubled their support nearly in the polls. But we see this in a war situation as well. And in the First World War, the people came out on the streets to defend the mobilization for war in 1914. The same people came out on the streets 4 years afterwards, and they overthrew the governments and the ruling classes who had sponsored and backed and benefited from that war. The great socialist Friedrich Engels once said that there's times in history when 20 years can be like a day, and there are other times when a day can seem like 20 years, when events are speeded up. And that's what this crisis has done and is doing now. And I think on the basis of the experience of the virus and of the economic penalties placed on the shoulders of working people afterwards, that initial mood of rallying behind the government will turn into its exact opposite and open up major opportunities for change, socialist and revolutionary change. And that is what we are preparing for now. That's it.
Thank you so much, Mick. It's great to see candidates like yourself that are in the parliament fighting on the behalf of the working class, and we need more of that. Corporations have their candidates, the ruling class has their candidates that they fund, and we need our own candidates. And we have to build workers' organizations and our own socialist organizations so that way we can fight against capitalism. So if you so far have liked what you heard and you want to help support the work that International Socialist Alternative is doing, please donate to our organization so we can continue to build and grow. So next we're going to go over to England, where Jackie Berry is a frontline intensive care nurse. I can only imagine the conditions she's working under right now. And she is a national executive of the Unison Union, but she is speaking on a personal capacity. So I'm going to kick it over to Jackie.
My name's Jackie Berry. I'm an intensive care nurse and I am a member of the National Executive Committee of Unison, although everything I say here is in an impersonal capacity. Being an intensive care nurse has never ever been an easy job, looking after people who are on life support. It's been made increasingly difficult with a decade of austerity impacting on public services, particularly the public health service in Britain. This week, our Prime Minister Boris Johnson joined in with a mass applause exercise where millions of people came out onto their doorsteps to clap and cheer for healthcare workers. Now, Johnson and his Tory government has spent a decade privatising healthcare, cutting services and suppressing the wages of healthcare workers. So it was total hypocrisy really for him to try and associate with that event. But what they're doing is they're holding up health workers as heroes and angels, but we're not. We're workers who are doing our very best in the most difficult circumstances, just like supermarket workers trying to keep everybody fed, transport workers trying to keep everybody moving who needs to, and utility workers who are keeping lights on and sewers running. What this crisis has demonstrated is that we are the working class, and we've proven that we are indispensable to society. I went out onto my doorstep on Thursday evening and the entire community had come out to clap and cheer with their kids, banging pots and pans, and it was an emotional experience, but you also got a sense for it of the potential power that there is in working class communities and what we could achieve with the right leadership and the right direction. And this is terrifying for the ruling class, which is why even right-wing politicians like Johnson are very keen to be associated with the popular groundswell of support that there is for health workers at the moment. We face a shortage of adequate personal protection equipment, which is putting healthcare workers in an incredibly vulnerable position, not just for catching lethal doses of the coronavirus, but it also makes us into spreaders of the disease as well. In Britain, because of the austerity measures, public laboratories were working to capacity in normal times. So now, in times of pandemic, labs are unable to cope with the additional pressure. And this is one of the reasons why the British government have been so resistant and reluctant to conduct widespread testing, despite the World Health Organization recommendations. Up until yesterday, only people admitted to hospital with difficulty breathing or the rich and powerful were able to even get tested. So Prince Charles has been tested. Boris Johnson has been tested. Yesterday, Friday, that is, the government announced that workers in critical care can now get a test. But if you're a porter going from hospital ward to hospital ward, you're not going to get tested. If you are a supermarket worker or a call centre operator or working on a construction site, you can basically forget it. And the only reason the government have granted this concession to workers in critical care is because we are indispensable at this juncture for capitalism, both materially, because if we're incapacitated, that will lead to a huge loss of life, and also politically, because if the nurses that were being clapped by the Prime Minister as heroes last week suddenly can't start dying due to a lack of personal protective equipment and testing next week, then the government has an irrecoverable problem on its hand. The shortage of PPE is a serious threat to healthcare workers. In places where we've got it, it has been down to the superhuman efforts of workers on the ground. It is not because the Health Minister, Matt Hancock, has decided who's also got coronavirus, by the way. It's not because he decreed that it would be so, and it's not because the system for accessing medical supplies is efficient. It is not. Despite the NHS, the British public health system, the NHS being a flagship for public health care, there is an internal market which exists within it. Private companies sell supplies to the NHS at a profit, and at the moment they are absolutely rubbing their hands. We've got competing companies selling FFP3 face masks, which are the only masks which offer protection against the coronavirus. Health workers have to be trained and fitted each time on each different mask, and you never know which mask is going to be available to you from 1 week to the next. That is the inefficiency of the free market. We've got Dyson, who are a British company that make very expensive hairdryers and vacuum cleaners, now turning their hand to manufacture ventilators. They've never made ventilators before. They've never been tried in clinical practice. No ICU nurse knows how to use a Dyson ventilator because they don't exist. But Dyson are donors to the Conservative Party, and Dyson are going to make huge profits out of this crisis. The seeds are being sown in this crisis for the reckoning that is going to come out of it. When this is over, in fact, not even when this is over, there are now already serious questions being asked on a mass scale. Why has our service been so underfunded that it can't cope? Why can't our healthcare professionals, our healthcare
Thank you so much, Jackie. It's insane to think about how difficult it is just to not only get the masks, but then being able to use them. It's a nightmare. We need to just nationalize these types of industries so that way, when we have pandemics like this, we have everything coming out in an orderly fashion. Everyone knows how to use it. It's just saddening to hear about how we don't have the protective equipment that we need for our most vulnerable workers. So next we're going to head over to Hong Kong, where we have Pasha, a member of Socialist Action, who's going to talk about the situation in Asia. Pasha?
My name's Jackie Berry. I'm intensive.
Hello, comrades. I'm Pasha from the Hong Kong, China, and Taiwan section of the ISA. Now, 2020 is the year of the coronavirus. The pandemic started in China, and now the whole capitalist world is shutting down. Now, this pandemic began in Wuhan, China. When the first cases of infection began to appear in Wuhan, there were several medical professionals, such as the eye doctor Li Wenliang, tried to raise the alarm. They clearly saw the danger of a new SARS-like virus, and if their cause had been heeded, the outbreak could have been stopped at an early stage. But why did nobody listen? Because this is China under the rule of a CCP dictatorship, which rigorously controls and censors the media and the mass communication systems. There was nobody to hear these warnings because the CCP censorship silenced them in the name of stability maintenance. Now, doctors who sounded alarm, like Dr. Li, were threatened by the superiors and even arrested by the police and made to sign documents to promise not to so-called spread lies. Dr. Li Wenliang then contracted COVID-19 and died in February. His death caused a typhoon of protests on the social media in China, which even the government censors couldn't control. Tens of millions of post comments hailing Li as hero and demanding the freedom of speech. Now, the CCP staged a massive cover-up from late December up until the 20th of January, when the government in Beijing finally admits officially the outbreak. That is why millions of people in China say that this epidemic is a man-made disaster. Now, Xi Jinping has declared a people's war against the coronavirus. But like in every war, it is the ordinary people, the poor, the workers, the elderly, the migrants who stand to lose the most. The rich, including the CCP top officials in China, don't have a problem in getting medical treatment. They can pay to jump the queue, and they can eat well and live well in the luxury homes, even if they are forced into quarantine. Healthcare workers and others on the front line, like China's low-paid sanitation workers, are the ones who are taking the biggest risks. Over 3,500 healthcare workers have been infected with the coronavirus, and at least 8 have died. Now, the economic crisis caused by the pandemic is also hitting the workers and the low-paid most of all. Officially, 5 million jobs have been lost in China since the outbreak, but the reality number of the unemployed among the poor migrant workers is much bigger. Migrant workers are the backbone of China's working class. Around 280 million migrants operate the factories, construction sites, and the service sectors. Without their labor, the world's factory grinds to a halt. But this is precarious employment with no job security, no pension, no medical insurance or unemployment assistance. Chinese workers are banned from forming trade unions, and strikes are illegal under the dictatorship. They are illegal. The only legal trade union is the dictatorship's own union, which acts as a tool to control the workers. During the pandemic, tens of millions of Chinese migrant workers have been left stranded by the lockdown, and they have not been paid for at least 2 months. It is estimated that they are owed 800 billion yuan, which is around 115 billion US dollars in lost wages. Now, China's economy is also shrinking as the emergency measures take their toll. The manufacturing sector has slumped by 15% and investment fell by 25% in the first 2 months of 2020. The government's target for the whole year of GDP growth, around 6%, has been blown away. China's healthcare system is also in a crisis because of the so-called market reforms, with frequent violent attacks on medical staff due to high costs and long queues for treatment. Now, the International Socialist Alternative, ISA, which includes us, Socialist Action in Hong Kong, and International Socialist Forward in Taiwan, is fighting for another world, a socialist world with full and immediate democratic rights for all, and a massive build-up for investment in public services such as the healthcare. To fight the pandemic, we need to nationalize the pharmaceutical industry under democratic and public control. The huge profits should be redirected and used to offer free public health care. We demand the independent trade union rights in China to end the suppression of the Chinese workers' basic democratic rights. There can be no talk of people's war if the people don't even have a voice. We demand full pay for all workers who are forced to stay home during the pandemic. The pandemic is not a people's war, but a class war. Capitalist governments want to make the working people pay for the pandemic and the crisis, as always. But the labor organizations need to organize to fight back for emergency measures in the interest of the working people. Join ISA and fight for socialism.
Thank you so much, Pasha. I can only imagine how fearful people must be in places like China, where trade unions, as you explained, are illegal and it's so difficult to organize. And that's why workers need to join organizations to help ourselves organize globally. And so if you're watching this video, no matter where you are in the world, please subscribe to our channel, comment, and check out our website to join International Socialist Alternative so we can begin to and continue to build that fight globally. So our last speaker is Socialist City Council member Shama Sawant. She's in Seattle, Washington in the United States. And she's going to talk about the conditions here and the legislation that she's fighting for in Seattle. Shama?
Thank you, Toya. Thank you all for having me. Solidarity from Socialist Alternative in the United States. The almost overnight onset of this crisis has been compared, as Susan was saying, to that of World War I. And it is on the scale of World War I, but as was said, it's like fighting two wars or against two enemies, capitalism and COVID-19. The projections for the United States are severe. And on Friday, this country officially became the epicenter of this crisis with 122,000 confirmed infections and 2,300 deaths. It's been predicted just today that the United States will likely have 100 to 200,000 deaths from COVID-19. I'm a Socialist City Council member in Seattle, which was the initial epicenter. The Seattle area was the initial epicenter of the crisis in this country. And after Washington State experienced its first death from coronavirus, concerned by the lack of any proactive response by the establishment, my council office publicly demanded that the local political establishment, including the mayor of Seattle, who is a straight up corporate politician, to take a serious approach to the emerging outbreak. Among other things, we called for free testing and treatment, guaranteed paid sick leave, and the ability to work from home. We initiated a petition that over 9,000 people in the area signed within 2 days, and we were able to win a moratorium on residential and small business evictions and foreclosures because people are not going to be able to pay their rent or mortgage. And we were able to win that moratorium within days. We used a social media protest campaign also to successfully end fair enforcement on public transit, which targets the lowest income people and the poorest people. And these victories show the power of having a Marxist elected office and connecting it to building movements led by working people and the difference that it can make in a crisis such as this. But these victories, while they are important, they are far, far from enough to deal with the scale of the calamity that has now befallen the working class in the United States and, of course, globally. The Trump administration has utterly failed from day one. Trump's initial response was to dismiss the threat of the virus. He completely failed to act on the need for protective medical gear for healthcare workers, for the need for ventilators, and the mishandling of this crisis has been absolutely criminal. But the failure is not just of Trump, and it's not just a failure from today or last month. Both the Republican and the Democratic political establishment have one thing in common, which is they put the interests of wealthy people and Wall Street and big corporations first. And both the party establishments have long fiercely opposed Medicare for all, which would be a publicly funded healthcare system that would actually deliver healthcare for the hundreds of millions of people. At a recent conference of American mayors, it was tabulated that cities right now need 28.5 million face masks, 24.4 million other items of personal protection equipment, 7.9 million test kits, and 139,000 ventilators. And Seattle, which is in Washington State, ranks second to last nationwide in both staffed hospital beds and ventilators. And keep in mind, this is a very wealthy state, and the Seattle area is headquarters to Amazon, which is $1 trillion corporation owned by the richest man in the world, and also for Boeing, which is one of the top 2 aerospace manufacturers in the world. In South Korea, they have been able to dramatically slow the onset of the crisis through mass testing. And meanwhile, in the US, in the richest country in the world, the immense majority of people continue to have no access to testing, and many have no access to affordable healthcare of any kind. And even frontline workers, healthcare workers, often cannot get tested, while rich people and politicians like right-wing Republican Senator Rand Paul, of course, have immediate access. Healthcare workers, grocery workers, sanitation and custodial workers, delivery workers, public transit workers, postal workers. These are the millions of workers who are right now putting their lives on the line every day and are being denied adequate safety measures and equipment, and are being denied even small measures that have been recommended by public health scientists, like having temperature checks every day. At the same time, the tens of millions of workers who have been told to stay home, many of them have been laid off, and the others who have not been laid off are being denied paid leave. So we have a massive crisis among working class people in the United States. The Federal Reserve just released their estimates, and they're saying that the United States is likely to have a 30% unemployment rate in the second quarter of this year. That is depression level numbers we're talking about. And just last week, the Department of Labor released numbers for people who've lost their jobs just in the last week. And just in this last week, over 3 million Americans have become unemployed. And that's an underestimate, because it's an estimate of the number of unemployment insurance filings. We know that many part-time workers, all of the gig economy workers, self-employed people, they don't qualify for unemployment. So it's well over 3 million Americans who have been made unemployed and have been made destitute just in the last week. And that's in the context of already the normal situation under US capitalism, of the vast majority of people not even having $1,000 put away for emergencies. Many small businesses which were already struggling are going to be completely wiped out, and some have already been wiped out. As Giuliano from Italy said, we are looking at the prospect of mass impoverishment in the United States and globally. This system, capitalism, will not do what is needed to address the pandemic, because its goal is to keep making profits for the bosses at any cost. Donald Trump recently said things should return to normal and people should go back to work by Easter. This is horrific. But he's not alone. Corporate politicians from both parties and the corporate media are pushing this idea in different forms, that we need to open businesses. They should be back open. New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo has just recently said things of that nature. The former CEO of Wells Fargo, which is a bank that has been indicted in criminal lawsuit after criminal lawsuit, this former CEO said, we'll gradually bring those people back up, those people meaning us workers, back, and see what happens. Some of them will get sick, some may even die. I don't know. Do you want to take an economic risk or a health risk? You get to choose. This is a billionaire speaking. But working class people in the US are experiencing a real mood of revolt, because we reject this false choice. We refuse to die for Wall Street. And that's why not dying for Wall Street was a trending hashtag on Twitter, because it's getting exposed. It's, as Susan was saying, the system is exposing itself, we are constantly told, working class people in the US are constantly told by the bosses, by the corporate media, by the politicians who defend Wall Street, who say, oh, we're all in it together. This is a shared sacrifice. But working people are starting to see we are not all in this together. This is not a shared sacrifice. And as a matter of fact, this system is so brutal and callous that it will literally send us to our deaths to keep making profits unless we fight back. And that's why it's important that American workers have started fighting back. Just a few days ago, there was a courageous, illegal wildcat strike by Black sanitation workers in Pittsburgh, and these are Teamster members. But this strike was led by rank and file workers, and they struck work on that day because they are angry that they are not getting any protective gear. As some of the workers said, I am putting my own life at risk every time I touch a garbage bag. How is it that our bosses cannot give us simple things like masks and gloves and the other things that we need to protect ourselves? The nurses in the Bronx in New York went on strike, maintaining social distancing, and it was really inspiring to see them standing 6 feet away from one another, demanding protective equipment. Tomorrow, the workers of Instacart, which is online ordering, they are going to be going on strike. And in fact, I'm really excited because just this afternoon, just a few hours from now, I'm going to be interviewing one of the strike leaders. So please look out for that interview, and please stand in solidarity with the workers. Around the country and internationally, millions are going to go without pay, or reduced pay at the best. And yet the rent and mortgage payments are going to come due. it's March 29th. The rent is going to be due in 3 days. What are ordinary people, ordinary Americans, working class Americans to do? My Socialist Council office and our organization, Socialist Alternative here, we've launched an online public campaign demanding that the state governor, Jay Inslee, immediately suspend all rent, mortgage, and utility payments for as long as this pandemic lasts. And we're very clear, suspension means people make no payments without adverse consequences like accruing back rent or incurring other debts, no eviction notices, no damage to credit rating. We're also demanding that the governor institute a statewide rent freeze through the end of 2020, meaning no rent increases. And the reason we had to do this, believe it or not, because of the absolutely grotesque nature of the private, corporate, for-profit housing market, where in the middle of this pandemic, landlords have started sending rent increase notices to the tenants. It's unbelievable. And this campaign, now has nearly 6,000 people as part of this campaign, but we will need to keep activating these thousands of people to keep fighting in the next few days if we are to win. Because in order to win, we have to dip the balance of, the scales in our favor against corporate landlords who are a very powerful lobby, not only in this state, but nationwide. Already we know big banks and Wall Street are going to get trillions of dollars in bailouts. And now there is this new bill that has been passed by the US Senate and US House, which will send a $1,200 check, one-time check to working people. This is important, and whatever pro-working class parts of this bill exist, they exist thanks to the revolt from below and to the rare political representatives like Bernie Sanders who stand with working people. But let me just say, it's an insult to tell working people that they should survive for who knows how many months on a one-time payment when big banks and the billionaires are feeding at the trough day after day, year after year, not only getting the trillions of dollars now in the bailouts, but already having exploited working people endlessly. That's why Socialist Alternative and we support Bernie Sanders' plan for a true $2 trillion bailout for workers, which includes $2,000 per month income for all working families. And we have to recognize that the Democratic establishment, while they have disagreements with Trump, certainly they are in agreement with Trump and the Republicans on one thing, which is always prioritize Wall Street profits. That is why we need a new party run of, by, and for the working class. And the crisis of this scale raises this question, of who pays? Who pays for this massive crisis that is unfolding? Will the billionaires pay for this crisis, or will the billions pay for it? The billionaires, of course, are determined that this crisis, as it's true with every crisis in this system, be paid for by the working class. The other problem for the billionaires is that any rational, adequate response, for a crisis of this magnitude would require, just rationally speaking, far-reaching measures. For example, the only way we could seriously minimize the loss of life in the United States will be if immediately hospitals begin to be run by nurses, doctors, and healthcare professionals, if aerospace and other plants are immediately taken into public ownership to manufacture ventilators, valves, whatever life-saving equipment is immediately essential. If non-essential consumer production facilities are repurposed to produce high standard medical and personal protective gear like masks, eye shields, and so on. If we start building new publicly owned production facilities for vaccines and tests, all of this will be necessary if the United States government is actually to have a response on the scale of this crisis. But the problem with these measures is that these measures look suspiciously like socialism, and there is no way the billionaires are going to do this. The last thing the billionaires want to do is to encourage the working class towards socialist ideas. That is precisely why workers are going to have to fight. It is not going to be good enough to make rational arguments. We are going to have to conduct a political struggle to win our rights in the context of this pandemic and beyond. That's why right now in Seattle, we are building a movement to make big business pay for this crisis instead of working people, and that's the Tax Amazon campaign. We all know the the way Amazon and its billionaires, especially the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, deal with their workers. He has so much money that it is hard to imagine how much $114 billion looks like. And he's the guy who tells his warehouse workers that they won't get enough breaks because he needs to make profit, so they have to pee in bottles. This was the normal situation. Right now, in the pandemic, delivery workers, drivers, warehouse workers are at very high risk. They're starting to test positive for COVID-19. They have no protective equipment. They have no other protections. And the executives of Amazon have gone so far as to say that the grocery workers at Whole Foods, which is a corporation owned by Amazon, they've told those workers that they should donate sick leave to one another. I mean, this is just horrible. It is actions like these by the capitalist class that is helping to clarify to working class people that the bosses are not on your side and they will never be on your side. Our Tax Amazon campaign is fighting for a massive expansion of social housing in Seattle, green built, union built, permanently affordable, publicly owned housing. And it's in fact going to be a massive jobs program, a public jobs program that would start next year in the context of what is very likely to be a long-standing recession or even a depression and a massive loss of jobs and high unemployment. And that's also in the context of a very bad housing crisis in our city and region, which is only going to get worse because of coronavirus. But first, we need to get this on the ballot. This initiative needs to get on the ballot so that all voters can vote for this. But in the midst of this pandemic, this is an unprecedented situation for us, and will take unprecedented effort because we cannot do this face to face as we normally do, standing outside grocery stores or workplaces and gathering signatures on clipboards. We can't do that in the times of social distancing. So we will need a different strategy. And that's why yesterday at our online socialist alternative rally, we launched a petition demanding that the state government allow us to gather signatures online. Once again, this will not be easy to win. We will have to win this fight and then win the fight to get it on the ballot, and then win on the ballot at in November. We're also bringing a similar legislation from my council office, demanding $500 million for coronavirus relief. And we're using this two-pronged approach, going to the voters directly and also trying at the city council level. And we're doing that because we have seen the Democratic establishment betray us over and over again. There are no Republicans in Seattle. The betrayals happen at the doorstep of the Democratic Party. I just wanted to say that this is, there's a reason why we are having this meeting with our speakers from around the world. Everything we do here in the US as Socialist Alternative, as the US working class, is linked to all the different struggles, whether it's Ireland or Italy or China, Hong Kong, Taiwan. It doesn't matter where you are. If you're watching this, it doesn't matter which country or which continent you're on. This pandemic has shown that the global working class needs to build international solidarity if we are to successfully fight against capitalism, because it's a global system. We have to stand with working people and the deeply oppressed on every continent. Just as an example, look at India. That's the country I grew up in. Hundreds of millions of people were already living on the margins. It's unimaginable. Many of them are migrant workers, and now those hundreds of millions are stranded because neither the right-wing pro-capitalist regime of Narendra Modi and the Bharatiya Janata Party, nor the other parties of the ruling class have any solution to the long-standing crisis in the country, let alone this pandemic. And now millions of Indians are in danger of perishing from hunger, sheer hunger, even if the coronavirus does not infect them, because many of them already have not had food for days. We simply cannot accept such a bankrupt system that subjects masses of people and the planet to such devastation. Humanity is capable of building a fundamentally different world where everybody has a high standard of living on a sustainable planet, but it will not happen automatically. It will not happen by hoping that the rich will do this because it is rational. It will only happen if the global working class gets organized, leads militant labor struggles, not just to win concrete victories on reforms, as hard as that will be to win, but to fight to take the top corporations into democratic public ownership by workers and run the corporations for the good of society, not for the profits of a handful of rich people, and go towards a revolutionary struggle to replace capitalism with a global socialist society. This is why, if you're watching this and if you're not a member of International Socialist Alternative yet, we need you to join us. History is calling on us, and we have to rise to the challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shama, and to all the speakers, and thanks everyone for tuning in. International Socialist Alternative is an organization of workers globally fighting to better our very lives. The problems we're seeing in our world are because humanity is not being put first. Profits and greed are what's being put first. And capitalism has proven itself incapable of maintaining a safe and healthy planet, and is creating conditions that are killing people, killing animals, and killing our environment. We need to organize ourselves internationally against capitalism and fight for a socialist world, one that produces for need and not for profit. If you agree that we need systematic change, then please join International Socialist Alternative and donate to our organization so we can keep fighting the different struggles we have around the world and fighting for a socialist world. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Hi, I'm Shama Sawant, a member of Socialist Alternative in the United States.
Jag heter Livia från Rättvisepartiet Socialisterna i Sverige.
I'm a member of Socialist Alternative in England, Wales and Scotland.
Soy Mauro de Alternativa Socialista en México.
I'm Amir Dosivey from Workers' and Socialist Party.
Ich bin Janine von der Sozialistischen Alternative.
I'm a member of the Socialist Party in Ireland.
I'm Natasha from Greece.
Olá, eu sou Jane Barros, sou militante da LSR, Liberdade, Socialismo e Revolução.
We, as members of the working class and as socialists in America, are fighting against Trump's right-wing regime.
Fighting sectarian division and building working class unity, our members are organised north and south and recently played a big role in the victorious workers' occupation of the Harland and Wolff shipyard.
Estamos trabajando para construir una alternativa socialista para los trabajadores y para la juventud.
Στο ξεκίνημα παλεύουμε ενάντια στις επιθέσεις της κυβέρνησης στα εργατικά και στα δημοκρατικά δικαιώματα.
E faço parte da luta com milhares de brasileiros e brasileiras que estão na linha de frente para lutar contra o governo Bolsonaro.
We are currently campaigning to have, self-organizing agenda strike on issues of national minimum wage, unemployment.
We're currently campaigning and protesting against the hated Boris Johnson Tory government.
Vi jobbar också för att tillsammans med unga formulera revolutionära socialistiska svar på utmaningarna som klimatkampen.
As many of you might already know, we just won a historic re-election campaign in Seattle, fighting against the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, Amazon Corporation, and Seattle's big business.
We're International Socialist Alternative, fighting capitalism and for socialism in over 30 countries around the world.